The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. The unicorn lived in a lilac wood, and she lived all alone. She was very old, though she did not know it, and she was no longer the careless color of sea foam, but rather the color of snow falling on a moonlit night. But her eyes were still clear and unwearied, and she still moved like a shadow on the sea. She did not look anything like the horned horse as unicorns are often pictured, being smaller and cloven-hoofed, and possessing that oldest, wildest grace that horses have never had, that deer have only in a shy, thin imitation, and goats in dancing mockery. Her neck was long and slender, making her head seem smaller than it was, and the mane that fell almost to the middle of her back was as soft as dandelion fluff, and as fine as cirrus. She had pointed ears and thin legs, with feathers of white hair at the ankles, and the long horn above her eyes shone and shivered with its own seashell light, even in the deepest midnight. She had killed dragons with it, and healed a king whose poisoned wound would not close, and knocked down ripe chestnuts for bear cubs. Unicorns are immortal. It is their nature to live alone in one place, usually a forest where there is a pool clear enough for them to see themselves, for they are a little vain, knowing themselves to be the most beautiful creatures in all the world, and magic besides. They mate very rarely, and no place is more enchanted than one where a unicorn has been born. The last time she had seen another unicorn, the young virgins who still come seeking her now and then had called to her in a different tongue. But then she had no idea of months and years and centuries, or even of seasons. It was always spring in her forest, because she lived there, and she wandered all day among the great beech trees, keeping watch over the animals that lived in the ground, and under bushes, in nests and caves, earths and treetops. Generation after generation, wolves and rabbits alike, they hunted and loved, and had children and died. And as the unicorn did none of these things, she never grew tired of watching them. One day it happened that two men with long bows rode through her forest, hunting for deer. The unicorn followed them, moving so warily that not even the horses knew she was near. The sight of men filled her with an old, slow, strange mixture of tenderness and terror. She never let one see her if she could help it, but she liked to watch them ride by and hear them talking. "I mislike the feel of this forest," the elder of the two hunters grumbled. "Creatures that live in a unicorn's wood learn a little magic of their own in time, mainly concerned with disappearing. We'll find no game here." "Unicorns are long gone," the second man said, "if indeed they ever were. This is a forest like any other." "Then why do the leaves never fall here, or the snow? I tell you there is one unicorn left in the world. Good luck to the lonely old thing, I say, and as long as it lives in this forest, there won't be a hunter who takes so much as a titmouse home at his saddle. Ride on, you'll see. I know their ways, unicorns." "From books," answered the other. "Only from books and tales and songs. Not in the reign of 3 kings has there been even a whisper of a unicorn seen in this country or any other. You know no more about unicorns than I do, for I've read the same books and heard the same tales, and I've never seen one either." The first hunter was silent for a time, and the second whistled sourly to himself. Then the first said, "My great-grandmother saw a unicorn once. She used to tell me about it when I was little." "Oh, indeed? And did she capture it with a golden bridle?" "No, she didn't have one. You don't have to have a golden bridle to catch a unicorn. That's part of the fairy tale. You need only to be pure of heart." Yes, the younger man chuckled. "Did she ride her unicorn then, bareback under the trees, like a nymph in the early days of the world?" "My great-grandmother was afraid of large animals," said the hunter. "She didn't ride it, but she sat very still, and the unicorn put its head in her lap and fell asleep. My great-grandmother never moved till it woke." What did it look like? Pliny describes the unicorn as being very ferocious, similar in the rest of its body to a horse, with the head of a deer, the feet of an elephant, the tail of a bear, a deep, bellowing voice, and a single black horn, 2 cubits in length. And the Chinese, my great-grandmother said only that the unicorn had a good smell. She never could abide the smell of any beast, even a cat or a cow, let alone a wild thing, but she loved the smell of the unicorn. She began to cry once, telling me about it. Of course, she was a very old woman then, and cried at anything that reminded her of her youth. "Let's turn around and hunt somewhere else," the second hunter said abruptly. The unicorn stepped softly into a thicket as they turned their horses, and took up the trail only when they were well ahead of her once more. The men rode in silence until they were nearing the edge of the forest, when the second hunter asked quietly, "Why did they go away, do you think, if there ever were such things?" "Who knows? Times change. Would you call this age a good one for unicorns?" "No, but I wonder if any man before us ever thought his time a good time for unicorns. And it seems to me now that I have heard stories. But I was sleepy with wine, or I was thinking of something else. Well, no matter. There's light enough yet to hunt if we hurry. Come." They broke out of the woods, kicked their horses to a gallop, and dashed away. But before they were out of sight, the first hunter looked back over his shoulder and called, just as though he could see the unicorn standing in shadow, "Stay where you are, poor beast. This is no world for you. Stay in your forest and keep your trees green and your friends long-lived. Pay no mind to young girls, for they never become anything more than silly old women. And good luck to you." The unicorn stood still at the edge of the forest and said aloud, "I am the only unicorn there is?" They were the first words she had spoken, even to herself, in more than 100 years. That can't be, she thought. She had never minded being alone, never seeing another unicorn, because she had always known that there were others like her in the world, and a unicorn needs no more than that for company. But I would know if all the others were gone. I'd be gone too. Nothing can happen to them that does not happen to me. Her own voice frightened her and made her want to be running. She moved along the dark paths of her forest, swift and shining, passing through sudden clearings unbearably brilliant with grass or soft with shadow, aware of everything around her, from the weeds that brushed her ankles to insect-quick flickers of blue and silver as the wind lifted the leaves. Oh, I could never leave this. I never could. Not if I really were the only unicorn in the world. I know how to live here. I know how everything smells and tastes and is. What could I ever search for in the world except this again? But when she stopped running at last and stood still, listening to the crows and a quarrel of squirrels over her head, she wondered, but suppose they are riding together, somewhere far away? What if they are hiding and waiting for me? From that first moment of doubt, there was no peace for her. From the time she first imagined leaving her forest, she could not stand in one place without wanting to be somewhere else. She trotted up and down beside her pool, restless and unhappy. Unicorns are not meant to make choices. She said no, and yes, and no again, day and night, and for the first time she began to feel the minutes crawling over her like worms. I will not go. Because men have seen no unicorns for a while does not mean they have all vanished. Even if it were true, I would not go. I live here. But at last she woke up in the middle of one warm night and said, "Yes, but now." She hurried through her forest, trying to look at nothing and smell nothing, trying not to feel her earth under her cloven hooves, the animals who move in the dark. The owls and the foxes and the deer raised their heads as she passed by, but she would not look at them. I must go quickly, she thought, and come back as soon as I can. Maybe I won't have to go very far. But whether I find the others or not, I will come back very soon as I can. Under the moon, the road that ran from the edge of her forest gleamed like water. But when she stepped out onto it, away from the trees, she felt how hard it was and how long. She almost turned back then, but instead she took a deep breath of the woods air that still drifted to her and held it in her mouth like a flower as long as she could. The long road hurried to nowhere and had no end. It ran through villages and small towns, flat country and mountains, stony barrens and meadows springing out of stones. But it belonged to none of these, and it never rested anywhere. It rushed the unicorn along, tugging at her feet like the tide, fretting at her, never letting her be quiet and listen to the air, as she was used to do. Her eyes were always full of dust, and her mane was stiff and heavy with dirt. Time had always passed her by in her forest, but now it was she who passed through time as she traveled. The colors of the trees changed, and the animals along the way grew heavy coats and lost them again. The clouds crept or hurried before the changing winds, and were pink and gold in the sun, or livid with storm. Wherever she went, she searched for her people, but she found no trace of them, and in all the tongues she heard spoken along the road, there was not even a word for them anymore. Early one morning, about to turn off the road to sleep, she saw a man hoeing in his garden. Knowing that she should hide, she stood still instead and watched him work, until he straightened and saw her. He was fat, and his cheeks jumped with every step he took. "Oh," he said, "oh, you're beautiful." When he tugged off his belt, made a loop in it, and moved clumsily toward her, the unicorn was more pleased than frightened. The man knew what she was, and what he himself was for, to hoe turnips and pursue something that shone, and could run faster than he could. She sidestepped his first lunge as lightly as though the wind of it had blown her out of his reach. "I have been hunted with bells and banners in my time," she told him. "Men knew that the only way to hunt me was to make the chase so wondrous that I would come near to see it, and even so I was never once captured." "My foot must have slipped," said the man. "Steady now, you pretty thing." "I've never really understood," the unicorn mused as the man picked himself up, "what you dream of doing with me once you've caught me." The man leaped again, and she slipped away from him like rain. "I don't think you know yourselves," she said. "Ah, steady, steady, easy now." The man's sweating face was striped with dirt, and he could hardly get his breath. "Pretty," he gasped. "You pretty little mare." "Mare?" The unicorn trumpeted the word so shrilly that the man stopped pursuing her and clapped his hands to his ears. "Mare?" she demanded. "I? A horse? Is that what you take me for? Is that what you see?" "Good horse," the fat man panted. He leaned on the fence and wiped his face. "Curry you up, clean you off. You'll be the prettiest old mare anywhere." He reached out with the belt again. "Take you to the fair," he said. "Come on, horse." "A horse," the unicorn said. "That's what you were trying to capture. A white mare with her mane full of burrs." As the man approached her, she hooked her horn through the belt, jerked it out of his grasp, and hurled it across the road into a patch of daisies. "A horse, am I?" she snorted. "A horse, indeed." For a moment, the man was very close to her, and her great eyes stared into his own, which were small and tired and amazed, and she turned and fled up the road, running so swiftly that those who saw her exclaimed, "Now there's a horse! There's a real horse!" One old man said quietly to his wife, "That's an Arab horse. I was on a ship with an Arab horse once." From that time, the unicorn avoided towns, even at night, unless there was no way at all to go around them. Even so, there were a few men who gave chase, but always to a wandering white mare, never in the gay and reverent manner proper into the pursuit of a unicorn. They came with ropes and nets and baits of sugar lumps, and they whistled and called her Bess and Nellie. Sometimes she would slow down enough to let their horses catch her scent, and then watch as the beasts reared and wheeled and ran away with their terrified riders. The horses always knew her. How can it be, she wondered. I suppose I could understand it if men had simply forgotten unicorn, or if they had changed so that they hated all unicorns now and tried to kill them when they saw them. But not to see them at all, to look at them and see something else. What do they look like to one another, then? What do trees look like to them, or houses, or real horses, or their own children? Sometimes she thought, if men no longer know what they are looking at, there may well be unicorns in the world yet, unknown, and glad of it. But she knew beyond hope and vanity that men had changed, and the world with them, because the unicorns were gone. Yet she went on along the hard road, although each day she wished a little more that she had never left her forest. Then, one afternoon, the butterfly wobbled out of a breeze and lit on the tip of her horn. He was velvet all over, dark and dusty, with golden spots on his wings, and he was as thin as a flower petal. Dancing along her horn, he saluted her with his curling feelers. I am a roving gambler. How do you do? The unicorn laughed for the first time in her travels. Butterfly, what are you doing out on such a windy day? She asked him. You'll take cold and die long before your time. Death takes what man would keep, said the butterfly, and leaves what man would lose. Blow wind and crack your cheeks. I warm my hands before the fire of life and get four-way relief. He glimmered like a scrap of owl light on her horn. You know what I am, butterfly, the unicorn asked hopefully, and he replied, Excellent, well, you're a fishmonger. You're my everything. You are my sunshine. You are old and grey and full of sleep. You're my pickle-face, consumptive Mary Jane. He paused, fluttering his wings against the wind, and added conversationally, Your name is a golden bell hung in my heart. I would break my body to pieces to call you once by your name. Say my name, then, the unicorn begged him. If you know my name, tell it to me. Rumpelstiltskin, the butterfly answered happily. Gotcha, you don't get no medal. He jigged and twinkled on her horn, singing, Won't you come home, Bill Bailey, won't you come home? Where once he could not go, buckle down, windsucky, go and catch a falling star. Clay lies still, but blood's a rover, so I should be called Kill Devil all the parish over. His eyes were gleaming scarlet in the glow of the unicorn's horn. She sighed and plodded on, both amused and disappointed. It serves you right, she told herself. You know better than to expect a butterfly to know your name. All they know are songs and poetry and anything else they hear. They mean well, but they can't keep things straight. And why should they? They die so soon. The butterfly swaggered before her eyes, singing, 1, 2, 3, O'Larry, as he whirled, chanting, I'll not carry on comfort, look down that lonesome road, for oh, what damned minutes tell he or who he dotes yet doubts, hasten, mirth, and bring with thee a host of furious fancies whereof I am commander, which will be on sale for 3 days only at bargain summer prices. I love you, I love you. Oh, the horror, and Arointhe, witch, Arointhe. Indeed, and truly you've chosen a bad place to be lame in. Willow, willow, willow. His voice tinkled in the unicorn's head like silver money falling. He traveled with her for the rest of the waning day, but when the sun went down and the sky was full of rosy fish, he flew off her horn and hovered in the air before her. I must take the A train, he said politely. Against the clouds, she could see that his velvet wings were ribbed with delicate black veins. Farewell, she said. I hope you hear many more songs. which was the best way she could think of to say goodbye to a butterfly. But instead of leaving her, he fluttered above her head, looking suddenly less dashing and a little nervous in the blue evening air. "Fly away," she urged him. "It's too cold for you to be out." But the butterfly still dallied, humming to himself. "They ride that horse you call the Macedoni," he intoned absent-mindedly, and then, very clearly, "Unicorn, Old French, unicorn, Latin unicornus, literally one-horned, unus, one, and cornu, a horn, a fabulous animal resembling a horse with one horn. Oh, I am a cook and a captain bold, and the mate of the Nancy brig. Has anybody here seen Kelly?" He strutted joyously in the air, and the first fireflies blinked around him in wonder and grave doubt. The unicorn was so startled and so happy to hear her name spoken at last that she overlooked the remark about the horse. "Oh, you do know me," she cried, and the breath of her delight blew the butterfly 20 feet away. When he came scrambling back to her, she pleaded, "Butterfly, if you really know who I am, tell me if you have ever seen anyone like me. Tell me which way I must go to find them. Where have they gone? Butterfly, butterfly, where shall I hide?" He sang in the fading light. "The sweet and bitter fool will presently appear. Christ, that my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again." He rested on the unicorn's horn once more, and she could feel him trembling. "Please," she said, "all I want to know is that there are other unicorns somewhere in the world. Butterfly, tell me that there are still others like me, and I will believe you and go home to my forest. I have been away so long, and I said that I would come back soon." Over the mountains of the moon, the butterfly began. Down the valley of the shadow, ride, boldly ride. Then he stopped suddenly and said in a strange voice, "No, no, listen. Don't listen to me, listen. You can find your people if you are brave. They passed down all the roads long ago, and the red bull ran close behind them and covered their footprints. Let nothing you dismay, but don't be half safe." His wings brushed against the unicorn's skin. "The red bull?" she asked. "What is the red bull?" The butterfly started to sing, "Follow me down, follow me down, follow me down, follow me down." But then he shook his head wildly and recited, "His firstling bull has majesty, and his horns are the horns of a wild ox. With them he shall push the peoples, all of them, to the ends of the earth. Listen, listen, listen quickly." "I am listening," the unicorn cried. "Where are my people, and what is the red bull?" But the butterfly swooped close to her ear, laughing. "I have nightmares about crawling around on the ground," he sang. "The little dogs, Tray, Blanche, Sue, they bark at me. The little snakes, they hiss at me. The beggars are coming to town. Then at last come the clams." For a moment more he danced in the dusk before her. Then he shivered away into the violet shadows by the roadside, chanting defiantly, "It's you or me, moth, hand to hand to hand to hand to hand." The last the unicorn saw of him was a tiny skittering between the trees, and her eyes might have deceived her, for the night was full of wings now. "At least he did recognize me," she thought sadly. "That means something." But she answered herself, "No, that means nothing at all, except that somebody once made up a song about unicorns, or a poem. But the Red Bull, what could he have meant by that? Another song, I suppose." She walked on slowly, and the night drew close about her. The sky was low and almost pure black, save for one spot of yellowing silver, where the moon paced behind the thick clouds. The unicorn sang softly to herself, a song she had heard a young girl singing in her forest long ago. "Sparrows and cats will live in my shoe, sooner than I will live with you. Fish will come walking out to sea, sooner than you will come back to me." She did not understand the words, but the song made her think longingly of her home. It seemed to her that she had heard autumn beginning to shake the beech trees that very moment that she stepped out onto the road. At last she lay down in the cold grass and fell asleep. Unicorns are the wariest of all wild things, but they sleep soundly when they sleep. All the same, if she had not been dreaming of home, she would surely have roused at the sound of wheels and jingling coming closer through the night, even though the wheels were muffled in rags and the little bells wrapped in wool. But she was very far away, farther than the soft bells could go, and she did not wake. There were 9 wagons, each draped in black, each drawn by a lean black horse, and each bearing barred sides like teeth when the wind blew through the black hangings. The lead wagon was driven by a squat old woman, and it bore signs on its shrouded sides that said with big letters, Mommy Fortuna's Midnight Carnival, and below, in smaller print, Creatures of Night brought to light. When the first wagon drew even with the place where the unicorn lay asleep, the old woman suddenly pulled her black horse to a stop. All the other wagons stopped too, and waited silently as the old woman swung herself to the ground with an ugly grace. Gliding close to the unicorn, she peered down at her for a long time and then said, Well, bless my old husk of a heart, and here I thought I'd seen the last of them. Her voice left a flavor of honey and gunpowder on the air. If he knew, she said, and she showed pebbly teeth as she smiled. But I don't think I'll tell him. She looked back at the black wagons and snapped her fingers twice. The drivers of the second and third wagon got down and came toward her. One was short and dark and stony like herself. The other was a tall, thin man with an air of resolute bewilderment. He wore an old black cloak, and his eyes were green. What do you see? The old woman asked the short man. Rook, what do you see lying there? Dead horse, he answered. No, not dead. Give it to the manticore or the dragon. His chuckle sounded like matches striking. You're a fool, Mommy Fortuna said to him. Then to the other, what about you, wizard, seer, thaumaturge? What do you see with your sorcerer's sight? She joined with the man Rook in a rackety roar of laughter. But it ended when she saw that the tall man was still staring at the unicorn. Answer me, you juggler, she snarled, but the tall man did not turn his head. The old woman turned it for him, reaching out a crab-like hand to yank his chin around. His eyes fell before her yellow stare. A horse, he muttered. A white mare. Mommy Fortuna looked at him for a long time. You're a fool too, magician, she snickered at last, but a worse fool than Rook, and a more dangerous one. He lies only out of greed, but you lie out of fear. Or could it be kindness? The man said nothing, and Mommy Fortuna laughed by herself. All right, she said. It's a white mare. I want her for the carnival. The 9th cage is empty. I'll need rope, Rook said. He was about to turn away, but the old woman stopped him. The only rope that could hold her, she told him, would be the cord with which the old gods bound the Fenris wolf. That one was made of fish's breath, bird spittle, a woman's beard, and a meowing of a cat, the sinews of a bear, and one thing more. I remember, mountain roots. Having none of these elements, not dwarves to weave them for us, we'll have to do the best we can with iron bars. I'll put a sleep on her thus. And Mommy Fortuna's hands knitted the night air while she grumbled a few unpleasant words in her throat. There was a smell of lightning about the unicorn when the old woman had finished her spell. Now, cage her, she said to the 2 men. She'll sleep till sunrise, whatever racket you make, unless, in your accustomed stupidity, you touch her with your hands. Take the 9th cage to pieces and build it around her, but beware, the hand that so much as brushes her mane turns instantly to the donkey's hoof it deserves to be. And she gazed mockingly at the tall, thin man. Your little tricks would be even harder for you than they already are, wizard, she said, wheezing. Get to work.
There's not much dark left.
When she was well out of earshot, sliding back into the shadow of her wagon as though she had just come out to mark the hour, the man called Rook spat and said curiously,
Now I wonder what's worrying the old squid. What would it matter if we touched the beast?
The magician answered him in a voice almost too soft to be heard. The touch of a human hand would wake her out of the deepest sleep the devil himself could lay on her, and Mommy Fortuna's no devil.
She'd like us to think so,
the dark man sneered.
Donkey hooves. Gah.
But he thrust his hands deep into his pockets.
Why would the spell be broken? It's just an old white mare.
But the magician was walking away toward the last of the black wagons. Hurry, he called over his shoulder. It will be day soon. It took them the rest of the night to pull down the 9th cage, bars and floor and roof, and then to put it back together around the sleeping unicorn. Rook was tugging at the door to make sure that it was securely locked when the gray trees in the east boiled over and the unicorn opened her eyes. The two men slipped hurriedly away, but the tall magician looked back in time to see the unicorn rise to her feet and stare at the iron bars, her low head swaying like the head of an old white horse. The 9 black wagons of the midnight carnival seemed smaller by daylight and not menacing at all, but flimsy and fragile as dead leaves. Their draperies were gone, and they were now adorned with sad black banners cut from blankets and stubby black ribbons that twitched in the breeze. They were arranged strangely in a scrubby field, a pentacle of cages enclosing a triangle, and Mommy Fortuna's wagon lumping in the center. This cage alone retained its black veil, concealing whatever it contained. Mommy Fortuna was nowhere to be seen. The man named Rook was leading a straggling crowd of country folk slowly from one cage to the next, commenting somberly on the beasts within.
This here's a manticore, man's head, lion's body, tail of a scorpion, captured at midnight, eating werewolves to sweeten its breath. Creatures of night, brought to light. Here's the dragon, breathes fire now and then, usually at people who poke it, little boy. Its inside is an inferno, but its skin is so cold, it burns. The dragon speaks 17 languages badly, and is subject to gout. The satyr, Lady Skeepback, a real troublemaker, captured under curious circumstances, revealed to gentlemen only, for a token fee after the show. Creatures of night.
Standing by the unicorn's cage, which was one of the inner 3, the tall magician watched the procession proceeding around the pentacle. I shouldn't be here, he said to the unicorn. The old woman warned me to stay away from you. He chuckled pleasantly. She has mocked me from the day I joined her, but I have made her nervous all that time. The unicorn hardly heard him. She turned and turned in her prison, her body shrinking from the touch of the iron bars all around her. No creature of man's night loves cold iron, and while the unicorn could endure its presence, the murderous smell of it seemed to turn her bones to sand and her blood to rain. The bars of her cage must have had some sort of spell on them, for they never stopped whispering evilly to one another in clawed, pattering voices. The heavy lock giggled and whined like a mad monkey. Tell me what you see, said the magician, as Mommy Fortuna had said it to him. Look at your fellow legends and tell me what you see. Rook's iron voice came clanging through the wan afternoon.
Gatekeeper of the underworld, 3 heads, and a healthy coat of vipers, as you can see. Last seen above ground in the time of Hercules, who dragged him up under one arm. But we lured him to light again, with promises of a better life. Cerberus, look at those 6 cheated red eyes. You may look into them again one day. This way to the Midgard serpent, this way. The unicorn stared through the bars at the animal in the cage. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. It's only a dog, she whispered. It's a hungry, unhappy dog,
with only one head and hardly any coat at all. The poor thing! How could they ever take it for Cerberus? Are they all blind? Look again, the magician said. And the satyr, the unicorn continued. The satyr is an ape, an old ape with a twisted foot. The dragon is a crocodile, much more likely to breathe fish than fire. And the great manticore is a lion, a perfectly good lion, but no more monstrous than the others. I don't understand.
It's got the whole world in its coils, Rook was droning, and once more the magician said, Look again. Then, as though her eyes were getting used to darkness, the unicorn began to perceive a second figure in each cage. They loomed hugely over the captives of the midnight carnival, and yet they were joined to them, stormy dreams sprung from a grain of truth. So there was a manticore, famine-eyed, slobber-mouthed, roaring, curving his deadly tail over his back, until the poisoned spine lolled and nodded just above his ear. And there was a lion, too, tiny and absurd by comparison. Yet they were the same creature. The unicorn stamped in wonder. And it was so in all the other cages. The shadow dragon opened his mouth and hissed harmless fire to make the gapers gasp and cringe, while hell's snake-furred watchdog howled triple dooms and devastations down on his betrayers. And the satyr limped leering to the bars, and beckoned young girls to impossible delights, right there in public. As for the crocodile, the ape, and the sad dog, they faded steadily before the marvelous phantoms, until they were only shadows themselves, even to the unicorn's undeceived eyes. This is a strange sorcery, she said softly. There's more meaning than magic to this. The magician laughed with pleasure and great relief. Well said indeed. I knew the old horror wouldn't dazzle you with her twopenny spells. His voice grew hard and secret. She's made her third mistake now, he said, and that's at least two too many for a tired old trickster like herself. The time draws near. The time draws near, Rook was telling the crowd, as though he had overheard the magician. Ragnarok, one day when the gods fall, the serpent of the Midgard will spit a storm of venom at great Thor himself, till he tumbles over like a poisoned fly, and so he waits for Judgment Day and dreams about the part he'll play. It may be so, I couldn't say. Creatures of night brought to light. The cage was filled with snake. There was no head in it and no tail, nothing but a wave of tarnished darkness rolling from one end of the cage to the other, leaving no room for anything but its own thunderous breathing. Only the unicorn saw, coiled in a corner, a baleful boa, brooding, perhaps, over its own judgment on the midnight carnival. But it was tiny and dim as the ghost of a worm in the serpent's shadow. A wondering gawk stuck up his hand and demanded of Rook, If this big snake do be coiled around the world, as you say, how come you to be having a piece of it in your wagon? And if it can shatter the sea just by stretching itself out, what's to keep it from crawling off wearing your whole show like a necklace? There were murmurs of agreement, and some of the murmurers began to back wearily away. I'm glad you asked me that, friend, Rook said with a scowl. It just so happens that the Midgard serpent exists in like another space from ours, another dimension. Normally, therefore, he's invisible, but dragged into our world, as Thor hooked him once. He shows clear as lightning, which also visits us from somewhere else, where it might look quite different, and naturally he might turn nasty if he knew that a bit of his tummy slack was on view daily and Sundays in Mommy Fortuna's midnight carnival. But he don't know. He's got other things to think about than what becomes of his belly button, and we take our chances, as do you all, on this continued tranquility. He rolled and stretched the last word like dough, and his hearers laughed carefully. Spells of seeming, the unicorn said. She cannot make things.
nor truly change them," added the magician. "Her shabby skill lies in disguise, and even that knack would be beyond her if it weren't for the eagerness of those gulls, those marks, to believe whatever comes easiest. She can't turn cream into butter, but she can give a lion the semblance of a manticore to eyes that want to see a manticore there, eyes that would take a real manticore for a lion, a dragon for a lizard, and the Midgard serpent for an earthquake, and a unicorn for a white mare." The unicorn halted in her slow, desperate round of the cage, realizing for the first time that the magician understood her speech. He smiled, and she saw that his face was frighteningly young for a grown man, untraveled by time, unvisited by grief or wisdom. "I know you," he said. The bars whispered wickedly between them. Rook was leading the crowd to the inner cages now. The unicorn asked the tall man, "Who are you?" "I am called Schmendrick the magician," he answered. "You won't have heard of me." The unicorn came very near to explaining that it was hardly for her to have heard of one wizard or another, but something sad and valiant in his voice kept her from it. The magician said, "I entertain the sightseers as they gather for the show. Miniature magic, sleight of hand, flowers to flags and flags to fish, all accompanied by a persuasive patter and a suggestion that I could work more ominous wonders if I chose. It's not much of a job, but I've had worse, and I'll have better one day. This is not the end." But the sound of his voice made the unicorn feel as though she were trapped forever, and once more she began pacing her cage, moving to keep her heart from bursting with the terror of being closed in. Rook was standing before a cage that contained nothing but a small brown spider, weaving a modest web across the bars. "Arachne of Lydia," he told the crowd, "guaranteed the greatest weaver in the world. Her fate's the proof of it. She had the bad luck to defeat the goddess Athena in a weaving contest. Athena was a sore loser, and Arachne is now a spider, creating only for Mommy Fortuna's midnight carnival, by special arrangement. Warp of snow and fluff of flame, and never any two the same, Arachne." Strung on the loom of iron bars, the web was very simple and almost colorless, except for an occasional rainbow shiver when the spider scuttled out onto it to put a thread right. But it drew the onlooker's eyes, and the unicorn's eyes as well, back and forth, and steadily deeper until they seemed to be looking down into great rifts in the world, black fissures that widened remorselessly, and yet would not fall into pieces as long as Arachne's web held the world together. The unicorn shook herself free with a sigh, and saw the real web again. It was very simple and almost colorless. "It isn't like the others," she said. "No," Schmendrick agreed grudgingly, "but there's no credit due to Mommy Fortuna for that. You see, the spider believes. She sees those cat's cradles herself and thinks them her own work. Belief makes all the difference to magic like Mommy Fortuna's. Why, if that troop of witlings withdrew their wonder, there'd be nothing left of all her witchery but the sound of a spider weeping, and no one would hear it." The unicorn did not want to look into the web again. She glanced at the cage closest to her own, and suddenly felt the breath in her body turning to cold iron. There sat on an oaken perch a creature with the body of a great bronze bird, and a hag's face, clenched and deadly as the talons with which she gripped the wood. She had the shaggy round ears of a bear, but down her scaly shoulders, mingling with the bright knives of her plumage, there fell hair the color of moonlight, thick and youthful around the hating human face. She glittered, but to look at her was to feel the light going out of the sky. Catching sight of the unicorn, she made a queer sound like a hiss and a chuckle together. The unicorn said quietly, "This one is real. This is the harpy Seleno." Smendrick's face had gone the color of oatmeal. "The old woman caught her by chance," he whispered, "asleep as she took you. But it was an ill fortune. and they both know it. Mommy Fortuna's craft is just sure enough to hold the monster, but its mere presence is wearing all of her spells so thin that in a little time she won't have power enough left to fry an egg. She should never have done it, never meddled with a real harpy, a real unicorn. The truth melts her magic, always, but she cannot keep from trying to make it serve her. But this time,
Sister of the Rainbow, believe it or not,
they heard Rook braying to the awed onlookers.
Her name means the Dark One, and one whose wings blacken the sky before a storm. She and her two sweet sisters nearly starved the King Phineas to death by snatching and befouling his food before he could eat it. But the sons of the North Wind made them quit that, didn't they?
The harpy made no sound, and Rook grinned like a cage himself.
She put up a fiercer fight than all the others put together, he went on, but it was like trying to bind all hell with a hair. But Mommy Fortuna's powers are great enough even for that. Creatures of night brought to light.
Few in the crowd laughed. The harpy's talons tightened on her perch until the wood cried out. You'll need to be free when she frees herself, the magician said. She mustn't catch you caged. I dare not touch the iron, the unicorn replied. My horn could open the lock, but I cannot reach it. I cannot get out. She was trembling with horror of the harpy, but her voice was quite calm. Schmendrick the magician drew himself up, several inches taller than the unicorn would have thought possible. Fear nothing, he began grandly. For all my air of mystery, I have a feeling heart. But he was interrupted by the approach of Rook and his followers, grown quieter than the grubby gang who had giggled at the manticore. The magician fled, calling back softly, Don't be afraid. Schmendrick is with you. Do nothing till you hear from me. His voice drifted to the unicorn, so faint and lonely that she was not sure whether she actually heard it or only felt it brush against her. It was growing dark. The crowd stood in front of her cage, peering in at her with a strange shyness. Rook said,
The unicorn,
and stepped aside. She heard hearts bounce, tears brewing, and breath going backward, but nobody said a word. By the sorrow and loss and sweetness in their faces, she knew that they recognized her, and she accepted their hunger as her homage. She thought of the hunter's great-grandmother, and wondered what it must be like to grow old and to cry.
Most shows, said Rook after a time, would end here, for what could they possibly present after a genuine unicorn? But Mommy Fortuna's Midnight Carnival holds one more mystery yet. A demon more destructive than the dragon, more monstrous than the manticore, more hideous than the harpy, and certainly more universal than the unicorn.
He waved his hand toward the last wagon, and the black hangings began to wriggle open, though there was no one pulling them.
Behold her, Rook cried. Behold the last, the very end. Behold Ellie.
Inside the cage, it was darker than the evening, and cold stirred behind the bars like a live thing. Something moved in the cold, and the unicorn saw Ellie, an old, bony, ragged woman who crouched in the cage, rocking and warming herself before a fire that was not there. She looked so frail that the weight of the darkness should have crushed her, and so helpless and alone that the watchers should have rushed forward in pity to free her. Instead, they began to back silently away, for all the world as though Ellie were stalking them. But she was not even looking at them. She sat in the dark and creaked a song to herself in a voice that sounded like a saw going through a tree, and a tree getting ready to fall. What is plucked will grow again. What is slain lives on. What is stolen will remain. What is gone is gone.
She doesn't look like much, does she? Rook asked. But no hero can stand before her. No god can wrestle her down. no magic can keep her out or in, for she's no prisoner of ours. Even while we exhibit her here, she is walking among you, touching and taking, for Ellie is old age." And the cold of the cage reached out to the unicorn, and wherever it touched her, she grew lame and feeble. She felt herself withering, loosening, felt her beauty leaving her with her breath. Ugliness swung from her mane, dragged it down her head, striped her tail, gaunted her body, ate up her coat, and ravaged her mind with remembrance of what she had once been. Somewhere nearby, the harpy made her low, eager sound, but the unicorn would gladly have huddled in the shadow of her bronze wings to hide from this last demon. Ellie's song sawed away at her heart. "What is sea-born dies on land. Soft is trod upon. What is given burns the hand. What is gone is gone." The show was over. The crowd was stealing away, no one alone, but in couples and fews and severals. Strangers holding strangers' hands, looking back often to see if Ellie were following. Rook called plaintively, "Won't the gentleman wait to hear the story about the satyr?" and sent a sour yowl of laughter chasing their slow flight. "Creatures of night, brought to light." They struggled through the stiffening air, past the unicorn's cage and on away, with Rook's laughter yapping them home, and Ellie still singing. "This is illusion," the unicorn told herself. "This is illusion," and somehow raised a head heavy with death to stare deep into the dark of the last cage and see, not old age, but Mommy Fortuna herself, stretching and snickering and clambering to the ground with her old eerie ease. And the unicorn knew then that she had not become mortal and ugly at all, but she did not feel beautiful again. Perhaps that was illusion too, she thought wearily. "I enjoyed that," Mommy Fortuna said to Rook. "I always do. I guess I'm just stage-struck at heart." "You better check on that damn harpy," Rook said. "I could feel her working loose this time. It was like I was a rope holding her, and she was untying me." He shuddered and lowered his voice. "Get rid of her," he said hoarsely, "before she scatters us across the sky like bloody clouds. She thinks about it all the time. I can feel her thinking about it." "Fool, be still." The witch's own voice was fierce with fear. "I can turn her into wind if she escapes, or into snow, or into 7 notes of music. But I chose to keep her. No other witch in the world holds a harpy captive, and none ever will. I would keep her if I could do it only by feeding her a piece of your liver every day." "Oh, that's nice," Rook said. He sidled away from her. "What if she only wanted your liver?" he demanded. "What would you do then?" "Feed her yours, anyway," Mommy Fortuna said. "She wouldn't know the difference. Harpies aren't bright." Alone in the moonlight, the old woman glided from cage to cage, rattling locks and prodding her enchantments as a housewife squeezes melons in the market. When she came to the harpy's cage, the monster made a sound as shrill as a spear and spread the horrid glory of its wings. For a moment, it seemed to the unicorn that the bars of the cage began to wriggle and run like rain. But Mommy Fortuna cracked her twiggy fingers, and the bars were iron again, and the harpy sank down on its perch, waiting. "Not yet," the witch said. "Not yet." They stared at each other with the same eyes. Mommy Fortuna said, "You're mine. If you kill me, you're still mine." The harpy did not move, but a cloud put out the moon. "Not yet," Mommy Fortuna said, and she turned toward the unicorn's cage. "Well," she said in her sweet, smoky voice, "I had you frightened for a little while, didn't I?" She laughed with a sound like snakes hurrying through mud, and strolled closer. "Whatever your friend the magician may say," she went on. I have some small art, after all, to trick a unicorn into believing herself old and foul. That takes a certain skill, I'd say. And is it a twopenny spell that holds the Dark One prisoner? No other till I, the unicorn replied. Do not boast, old woman. Your death sits in that cage and hears you. Yes, Mommy Fortuna said calmly, but at least I know where it is. You were out on the road, hunting for your own death. She laughed again, and I know where that one is, too. But I spared you the finding of it, and you should be grateful for that. Forgetting where she was, the unicorn pressed forward against the bars. They hurt her, but she did not draw back. The Red Bull, she said. Where can I find the Red Bull? Mommy Fortuna stepped very close to the cage. The Red Bull of King Haggard, she muttered. So you know of the bull. She showed 2 of her teeth. Well, he'll not have you, she said. You belong to me. The unicorn shook her head. You know better, she answered gently. Free the harpy while there is still time, and set me free as well. Keep your poor shadows, if you will, but let us go. The witch's stagnant eyes blazed up so savagely bright that a ragged company of Luna moths off to a night's revel fluttered straight into them and sizzled into snowy ashes. I'd quit show business first, she snarled, trudging through eternity, hauling my homemade horrors. Do you think that was my dream when I was young and evil? You think I chose this meager magic, sprung of stupidity, because I never knew the true witchery? I play tricks with dogs and monkeys because I cannot touch the grass, but I know the difference. And now you ask me to give up the sight of you, the presence of your power. I told Rook I'd feed his liver to the harpy if I had to, and so I would. And to keep you, I'd take your friend Schmendrick and I'd... She raged herself to gibberish, and at last to silence. Speaking of livers, the unicorn said, real magic can never be made by offering up someone else's liver. You must tear out your own and not expect to get it back. The true witches know that. A few grains of sand rustled down Mommy Fortuna's cheek as she stared at the unicorn. All witches weep like that. She turned and walked swiftly toward her wagon, but suddenly she turned again and grinned her grubby grin. But I tricked you twice anyway, she said. Did you really think those gogglers knew you for yourself without any help from me? No, I had to give you an aspect they could understand, and a horn they could see. These days it takes a cheap carnival witch to make folk recognize a real unicorn. You'd do much better to stay with me and be false, for in this whole world only the Red Bull will know you when he sees you. She disappeared into her wagon, and the harpy let the moon come out again.